Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you taking time from your busy afternoon to listen to this webinar. I'm Paul Chambliss, the West Tennessee Loss Control Consultant for the Public Entity Partners. I am currently closing in on 32 years. It's been a fantastic journey. I've seen a lot of faces come and go over that time. I even lived through a name change with the company. However, our purpose has never changed. It's always remained the same, that is to serve our members. Today, I have my coworker, Sarah Curtis, to jointly conduct this webinar on special events. Sarah is the statewide training consultant for the Public Entity Partners. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to approach this webinar as a Q&A as opposed to a mere lecture. A successful special event involves planning and preparation on your part as well as our part. A successful special event can be a great asset to your entity. However, when an injury occurs, they can become not so special. And then the media shows up. But our goal is to always make special events just that, special. It's outside of my realm to discuss coverage issues in any great detail. Instead, my discussion will focus mainly on loss control aspect. I will give you my 2 cents worth, and then when I'm done, you'll have 98 cents left. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you again to Paul for allowing me to interview him for today's session. As we move through the interview, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We will look at those at the end of our interview today. We will be able to answer some questions, but just know that while we will talk a little bit about coverage and exclusions today, if you have a specific question about your policy and coverage limitations, that might be better to answer offline. So I will give you some contact information when we're finished today. You will get the recording, and after we finish the Q&A portion of this, I will put a summary up, and I will give you some resources that you will be able to use. So with that, we will go ahead and jump right in. So Paul, when I think of special events that public entities, might hold, I generally think of parades. But what are some of the other events that are common with our members?
Well, they pretty much run the gambit of things. We have fish fries, barbecues, marathon, relays for life, concerts, petting zoos, political rallies, graduations, wedding, sporting events, and fireworks. And fireworks, they have special rules that go with that. I even have one small city in West Tennessee that conducts funerals in City Hall. So it pretty much runs the whole spectrum. Special events can be organized and promoted by the entity in whole or in part. They can occur on property owned by the entity, or it may be held on another person's property. It may be that the event is merely taking place on property owned by the entity. We see that a lot in fire departments where they'll have fish fries, cook-offs, that type thing, where they're just letting them bar the fire hall. With multiple parties, there are multiple ways for this to happen and go about.
So while it sounds like there are many types of special events, they probably all have similar risk management goals. And so can you explain what those goals are?
Yeah, risk management goals, they're certainly worthy of our best efforts because they pose a danger to our entity as well as us. They represent a financial loss and a personal injury loss up to and including unintentional death. Unfortunately, we've had that happen. To reduce the likelihood of losses and injuries to participants as well as the organization, we assure that operations are legal in light of all the applicable statutes, zoning ordinances, permits, etc. It's an opportunity to tie up on the loose ends before we get started, determine what I call a situation analysis of the event in the planning stage. And as with any activity, there's always risk. Some people would argue that the ultimate risk is to assume no risk, but some risk is worth taking, some is not. That's a decision that we leave up to the entity.
So if we need to assume that there's always risk involved, then can you share with us some of the common risks that we see associated with special events?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I would say alcohol. Some people, or I call it liquid faith, improper or poor maintenance of equipment and facilities, failure to inspect prior to the event, rides, amusement rides, fireworks, and they have special rules, inflatables, animals, weapons, poor training or no training. And I think the real caveat here is when you're dealing with young children. As a general rule, young children lack the capacity to assume the risk. Therefore, we will likely lose our best defense, known as the assumption of risk. When children are involved, a higher duty of care is owed to children. Young children simply lack the capacity to assume the risk. They don't understand the risk. And the courts are very sympathetic to the protection of children in society, as they should be. As with most things, an ounce of prevention is simply worth a pound of cure.
So with the many risks that are associated with the special events that our members have, it might seem somewhat overwhelming at first and difficult to really know where it is you need to start when you're planning a special event. So what are the factors entities should consider prior to hosting a special event? And what are some of the things that we can do to help manage those risks?
Well, I think gather as much information as possible on the event, the who, what, where, when, and why. Ultimately, the decision to have the event and what to include in it lies with the entity. We will never get in the business of telling our members how to run your special event. That's up to you, how to manage your city and the event. Instead, our job is to provide the entity as much applicable information as possible to help them determine and make an informed decision that will suit their needs. In the final analysis, it boils down to your appetite for risk. Our analysis comes from underwriting, loss control, as well as client services. But again, just to gather as much information as possible on the front end is I think, the best. Underwriting provides the deepest analysis because they are determining coverage based on the insurance contract between the member and us. An insurance contract is a contract of adhesion, a little bit different than the contract where you get on a car or a house. It is a unilateral contract in nature. The bargaining power is not present in a unilateral contract the way it is in a bilateral contract. In bilateral contracts, they are subject to counter offers and negotiation between the parties. In a bilateral situation, there's a benefit to the promisor and a detriment to the promisee. If you enjoy reading insurance contracts, there is help available for you. If you have an agent, by all means, get that agent involved. Uh, they can really help you in the decision-making process as to where the risk is and what to assume and what not to assume. They can be a very valuable resource to you.
Okay. So, Paul, you said you've been doing this for about 32 years. Some of us are newer. A lot of our members are newer to risk management. So can you explain a little bit about liability and what entities can do to reduce liability when it comes to special events? Like, are there ways that you can transfer some of the risk?
Yes. First of all, most people alive are younger than me. But liability is probably the most often asked question I get out in the field. We're thinking about doing X, Y, Z. What's the liability? Where would it begin? Where would it end? This area provides a very, very important step in the evaluation process. I think of it and I call it the river of liability. When we don't control the river, it floods and causes damage to foreseen and unforeseen property and life. Those in the immediate flood zone and those outside the normal flood zone. Us and the entity are in the immediate flood zone because we are seen as the deep pocket. We're seen that by society, by the courts sometimes, and the media. The deep pocket would likely make our actions or inactions the proximate cause of the incident. After all, it's a financial transaction attempting to place the injured party back to where they were prior to the accident or incident. It's an attempt to make them whole again. The proximate cause is a cause in fact in the chain of causes in fact that legal liability attaches. Really, there's more to it than that, though. Proximate cause isn't always about the law. It isn't always about the facts. It's about assigning blame. Who can make that person that's injured whole again as nearly as possible? So the blame game ends up with the deep pocket. There was a case in the early 90s in Savannah, Tennessee that put another bullet in that gun. In the McIntyre-Ballantyne decision, the Tennessee Supreme Court changed the phrase. Instead of being the proximate cause, it was a proximate cause, implying that we have multiple proximate causes now. So that widened the landing strip for the plaintiff's attorney. So to me, liability is like the Mississippi River. We can channelize it, but we can't dam it up. Generally, you're responsible for what you say, what you own, and what you do if negligence is present. That's why we call ourselves loss control and not loss prevention. We cannot prevent all liability. It's just a part of the doing business in today's society. There are certain tools that we use to channelize the river of liability away from the entity. We can have waivers, risk transfer, indemnification agreements, releases of liability, securing certificates of liability insurance, naming the entity as an additional insured. If they balk on that, my experience says that's probably a red flag for you. Prior and post inspections of the event, the premises, and equipment. This is especially essential when you're dealing with premises liability only. Risk avoidance is another tool, but it's not always possible. Hold harmless agreements, contractual agreements. For a simple guy like me to understand special event liability, I draw a line, a horizontal line on a piece of paper. On one end of that line, I have the public entity partners. On the other end, I have Anytown, Tennessee. We will defend Anytown, Tennessee for the things that Anytown is doing. But people who fall outside that line, generally speaking, coverage does not extend to those third parties. Although we might be brought into a lawsuit by those outside the line, our defense would be enhanced with these control measures that I just mentioned in place. Without the control measures, our defense is likely anemic. So we will defend Anytown based on the contract of insurance, subject to the definitions, the exclusions, parameters, and terms of the policy. It's always one of those. Let's talk about exclusions. If you're ever at a cocktail party and somebody's bugging you, you start talking about insurance exclusions, I promise you they'll dissipate. Certain things may be excluded because the risk is simply too great, or the actions or equipment are inherently dangerous, which could lead us to strict liability, or our defenses are not as strong. Many times exclusions exist prior to, as a result of bad outcomes that have happened historically. I'm sure most of you have listened to Mr. Michael Fan, our president, in his training. He will say bad cases make bad laws. Well, that's true. Bad outcomes can create exclusions over time in an insurance policy. Often they involve activities that you cannot make safe. Helicopters, aircraft in general, lions, tigers, bears, firing cannons at war reenactments, cage fighting, things that just go against your common sense that you can't make them safe. They're inherently dangerous in and of themselves. Sometimes your common sense can often tell you if an event is going to be covered. Don't rely on that, but it's good as a rule of thumb. Let me kind of expand on that as a narrative analysis by way of an example. If you had to sum up the Bible or religion or the doctrine of Christianity to someone who knew nothing about it, if you had to sum up that in one word, what would that word be? My guess would be love. It's the theme that runs through all Christianity. Love thy neighbor, love and honor thy mother and father. It's kind of the standard that goes with religion. Well, there's a common thread that runs through insurance agreements, contracts, and the law and binding agreements. It's called reasonable. Is the activity reasonable? When you read cases, the court will talk about, well, he or she acted like a reasonable police officer under similar and like circumstances. Tigers, bears, lions, race cars at 150 miles an hour within 6 feet of children are not reasonable activities. But reasonableness is not merely a buzzword. It's not merely a catch-all phrase for us to bounce around. Instead, it's the court-mandated standard of conduct that we're expected to live by. It's the litmus test for our lives. It is the bedrock basis and the capstone of the tort law from top to bottom. So, when an event is planned that is not covered or is excluded, your choices are pretty much these. You can roll the dice and hope nothing happens. May not. But keep in mind there's Murphy's Law. And another way of putting, I guess, if there's a chance greater than zero of an event occurring, it will occur. It's just a question of time. So it's a mathematical certainty. Number two, you can get certificate of liability insurance from all those who fall outside the coverage, naming the entity as additional insured. You need to be named on the policy. Just mentioning or showing insurance is probably not going to get us to home plate. You can secure a one-time event policy. We got Christmas coming up, holiday season. A lot of people will be doing parades. There may be some gaps in coverage with that. And, for a small town, it may cost $500 to $2,500, somewhere in that neighborhood, to get a one-time, one-day event policy. I know that's quite a few coins. However, if we get sued, it costs us about $20,000 just to answer the complaint. So we can get into a lot of money really quickly with that. We have a special events exposure checklist. It's not mandatory to fill out, but it is a very useful item. It is a superb discovery tool for our members and us. I call it the assess and address document. I pay special attention to it. If you fill out this attachment prior to the event, return it to us. Underwriting will then provide you with a situation analysis on where coverage ends and begins. Again, it's not mandatory, but it's a discovery tool. This document is not an obstacle on your path. It pretty much is your path to guide us to a successful event. Again, it's the who, what, where, when, and why document. The rules for special events are pretty straightforward. But like a lot of things in life, when you start applying the facts, they can murky the water. It can get muddy. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And I will show everyone an example of that document in just a few minutes, and we'll make sure that if you need a copy of it, that you can get it. So, Paul, the last question I want to ask you, obviously the purpose of this webinar is not to call anyone out, but I have worked with Paul for 2 years now, and one of the things that I, as well as many of my colleagues, really enjoy is to listen to Paul tell stories. So I can't let him leave here this afternoon without telling us, are there any examples that you can give to us of special events that either went wrong or maybe could have gone wrong had certain things not been put in place, or maybe they just chose not to do it?
There are. I thought you would never ask. Don't try to figure out the cities, because I have changed the names to protect the guilty. One Thursday afternoon, I got a call from a small city recorder. Said, hey, we're having I guess a special event here Saturday at the fire hall. I said, okay, what's going on? Well, we're going to have a fish fry barbecue cook-off for a 13-year-old girl who's taking cancer treatments. Obviously, no one is against that. So I then began to ask her a few questions, and I said, I am not an underwriter, but I want to get them as much information as possible. And one of my first questions to her was, well, tell me what the city's involvement is. She said, we don't have an involvement other than we're lending them the fire hall. Okay, so the first thing that popped in my mind is a pre-inspection would be needed on the facilities or the premise liability. And I said, well, who's doing the cooking? Well, the Mid-South Catfish Cookers and the Mid-South Barbecue Association. They're bringing the meat, they're bringing the cookers, they're bringing their trailers, they're setting it up, they're doing everything. Okay. She said, that's our only involvement. So we talked a few months and I said, well, to be on the safe side, you might consider getting certificates of liability insurance, naming the city as additional insured. She wasn't very happy with that answer. She said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You're telling me that these people are donating their time, their money, their effort, and their meat to come and cook to raise money for this child, and you want me to insult them by asking them for insurance? I said, ma'am, I'm not saying I want you to. I'm just saying that's probably, if we live in a perfect world, that's to protect our interests. That's probably a good suggestion. Well, she said a few words about motherhood and inheritance and slammed the phone up. Monday morning, I went into the office. The phone was ringing. It was her. I said, what happened? You have a bad feeling about certain things. You just kind of feel it coming. Well, 8-year-old boy's running up and down the hall in the fire department, trips over an extension cord, pulls a big pot of boiling grease over on top of it. Horrendous mistake. They had, of course, the firefighters were there. They had paramedics. They did what they could for him. They called E911. They sent a helicopter. They carried him to Baptist East in Memphis. They gave him a shot of morphine, said there's nothing we can do for him. Go to the Atlanta Burn Center. They're looking at about a year's worth of treatment, plastic surgery, and skin grafting, somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 million. Well, I don't know too many people that have $10 million lying around they're not using. And she was still irate. She just couldn't understand that we might not pay that. And I said, well, before you got mad at me, you and your husband always have a dove hunt every year on your farm. She goes, yeah. I said, well, what if I came down with a couple of buddies and we're out there dove hunting and they get to drinking and get carried away and one of them shoots me and they fly me to Baptist East? Are you going to pay for my hospital bills and the flight and the helicopter? Are you going to pay for all that? Well, no, I wouldn't pay for that. I said, why not? It happened on your property. She said, yeah, I see now. And it was an innocent mistake. They just weren't thinking through. Of course, as you add facts, things get difficult. For example, on the premise liability, for example, for purposes of argumentation, if there was a drain cover missing in the floor that had been missing for a year, and we were on notice that it was missing, or through reasonable diligence, we should know. If the child steps into that hole, then falls into the grease, well, then the boat begins to drift in the wrong direction for us. Things begin to change when that happens. Anyway, the last I heard, the young man survived and is doing pretty well. Another one, again, I've changed the name. I'll call it the Old West Festival. This is one that I kind of use as an example of a failed pre-inspection prior to the event. This is kind of what it stands for. At any rate, grown men, one group would dress up as cowboys, the other group would dress up as Indians, and they would ride around, circle the wagons, shooting the old 1873 Winchester rifles, the old lever action, and they were playing cowboys and Indians. They were shooting blanks, of course. Well, one person accidentally put a live bullet in there and shot someone. So when you start reading these things and thinking about them, these are why things are excluded a lot of times in insurance policies. We don't cover war reenactments anymore. Don't know how much that contributed to it, but it may have. That's just an inherently dangerous activity. But if there'd been a pre-inspection of the ammo, et cetera, that might have been avoided. This is a number 3. There are many of these I could go over. We don't have enough time, but the next one is kind of a conglomerate of situations. I knew the guy very well, so I felt freely to talk candidly to him. He called me one morning. He said, hey, man, we're going to have a special event down here Saturday. I'm pretty sure it's going to be okay. Just wanted to make sure. I laughed. I said, Kenneth, it's not okay. You wouldn't be calling me. We laughed a moment. I was just joking with him. Like I said, we were friends. I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, we've got a guy here that's going to it's going to let us borrow some percherons. And for you people that don't know what horses are, a percheron is a very big, strong horse that was used in the 1800s to pull timber out of the woods with. They're almost like a Clydesdale. They're super strong out. He's gonna lend us the percherons. We're gonna hook them some wagons. We're gonna cross the 4 lane. We're gonna shut it down and go down to the Confederate cemetery and blast the cannons off. Do y'all, as reasonable people, do you see any problem with that scenario? Well, obviously it's riddled with problems. And I sat there and I said, well, Kenneth, tell me you're going to be shooting blanks. No, we're going to put tennis balls, golf balls, maybe some carpet nails in there, but we're going to be shooting them over the cemeteries. And that's not going to hurt anybody. I said, no, you probably won't get a lot of feedback from those folks. However, I don't know. I sat there and he just kept talking. I said, Kenneth, I have a question for you. He said, yeah. I said, why would you want to do that? He said, well, we want to go down there and shoot the cannons off to blast out over the cemetery. We are celebrating the Confederate history and our Confederate heritage. Again, I knew him well, or I wouldn't have said this. I said, well, in essence, you're telling me that you're celebrating and getting your rear end kicked. Because the last time I remember studying that, Sherman marched all the way to the sea. If it was standing, he knocked it down. If it was alive, he killed it. It was the darkest hour in our country's history. It's a time when people were treated worse than animals. Don't think I want to celebrate that. That's not reasonable to fire a cannon with live ammo. And no, we can't defend a cannon. I didn't even have, I don't think I even called the underwriter on that. That's just not reasonable behavior. But if we did defend the cannon, that would not be fair to the other members of the public entity partners. That wouldn't be fair to Clinton, to Orm, to Paris, and the other members that would have had to chip in. Ultra hazardous activities can lead to strict liability. Remember that. But we are sharing pools. So, what we do, we have a fiduciary obligation to our individual members, but what one member does can affect us all. We are coming down to the 2-minute warning. I want to thank all of you for attending this today. This is my first one. I hope you got something out of it. And I guess my final message is you don't have to go through the special events alone. We're here for you. We're here to help you. And I think Sarah has some parting words for us. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And thank you again for sharing that information and also your stories, because I think that they're a good example of that. While we may have advice for you, we may have guidance, we'll talk to you about coverage. We are not here to tell you what you can and can't do. But as Paul said, you want to consider, is this reasonable? Is it worth taking the risk? So I want to just kind of summarize a few things, and then I'll share with you some resources, and then we will take any questions you might have. So as Paul said, special events are a good thing. They're a great way for you to engage with the community. It's important that you do these things for the communities that you serve, and we encourage you to do them, but they need to be well planned. And so it's important, especially if you do special events a lot, that you have a special events program in your entity that's part of any risk management program that you might have. That is definitely part of it. So you want to have your written policies, you want to have any applications that you might need, forms, checklists, things like that. I will share with you our portal in a moment where you can get some examples and some guidelines on those things. I think it's also important to consider, sometimes we see when a special event is being planned that sort of one person takes charge on that, and that's a good thing. But it's important, especially when evaluating risk, that you're bringing everyone to the table, because you're alone might not know all of the risks that could be associated with that event. And so you have, especially if you're one of our municipalities, You have departments like Public Works, Police, Fire, even Parks and Rec staff. They can help you evaluate any risks because they're out there in the field. They see these things, and they have some experience with that. So make sure that you're bringing everyone to the table to discuss the potential risks, because that is the first thing that you want to do. If you're thinking about a special event, you need to know what the risks are associated with that. And then finally, Paul mentioned to you the exposure checklist that we have. If that's something that you've already done for a special event that you do every year, like he said, you don't have to fill that out. But early communication with all stakeholders involved, including your insurance carrier, is vital. So we will share that form with you. I will give you some contact information. If you don't get it today, you can get it later. But it is a very thorough checklist that once you go through it and we can take it back, we can evaluate that. Underwriting will look at it. That will help you to understand your coverage and any exclusions, as well as maybe the risk transfer options that Paul talked about, and other loss control efforts. So these are some of the things that you want to start with when planning your special event. So here is a copy of that exposure checklist that we have. You can see that it's extremely thorough. It's going to ask you all the important questions that we would need to know to help you evaluate an event like this. So we will get you a copy of that if you need it. We always encourage you to reach out to us if you are having a special event. Here are a couple of QR codes. If you have your phone with you today, you'll be able to scan these and it'll take you directly to our website, to our portal. In that portal, you will find things like hold harmless agreements, some model contracts that we have, some guidelines on things like fireworks and parades. There's a lot of good information in there. If you do not have access to that portal, please reach out to us and we will make sure that we get you access to the risk library. The other QR code that I have here is for the Tennessee Department of Labor. That's their amusement device unit. We wanted to mention this. I know that we do have a few of our municipalities have annual permits with the amusement device unit that's part of the Department of Labor. Most of you don't, but if you go to that website, you will see a list of what is defined as an amusement device that you might have at your special event. And there is some permitting requirements there. You will also see a list of a safety officer for each Grand Division. So you'll see East, Middle, and West there, and you can find who it is you need to reach out to with the state to see if there are any permits that you might need to have. So we encourage you to use all resources that you have at your disposal when you're considering planning a special event. So here are your contacts at Public Entity Partners in West Tennessee. You all just met Paul if you hadn't met him before. We have Stacy in underwriting. In middle, we have Bob and Aaliyah. And then in East Tennessee, we have Michael and Daphne. So they will be able to help you with any questions that you might have. As always, we are here to serve you. We want to help you make your special event a success. But again, we're not going to tell you what you can and can't do, but we are going to talk to you about loss control efforts you need to take. We may have some advice that maybe you don't do something, but we want you to mainly understand what the exclusions are and any coverage limitations there might be. So with that, we will take any questions that you have. You can put those in the chat. Again, if it's something specific to your policy and your coverage, we can answer that offline. So do we have anything? I'll give you just a minute if you want to type anything into the chat. Okay, Paul, I'm not seeing anything. So with that, we will go ahead and end today's webinar. We want to thank you again for joining us today. We always appreciate your participation in these events. The recording will be made available to you. If there's any information that you need from us, please feel free to reach out. We will let you know when our next webinar is scheduled, and we hope to see you all for that soon. So thank you again for attending, and we hope you have a great day.
Here, we have one question.
Oh, we do? Okay.
Uh,
So the question is, what if we give out permits for parades that take place on our roads? Do we need to request that the school get event insurance, or should we do that?
Well, I think that's a question that probably needs to go through underwriting.
So I think I'm Haley Gallick. I'm sitting here with Amber Turner. And so I think we can answer it. We can reach back out to Kelly and answer that. But anytime you shut down your roads, you want to make sure that you're following any ordinances that you have in place. Likely, if there's a parade that you're not sponsoring, organizing, or directing, you would want to require that third party to have a special event policy. If it's a parade that you're sponsoring, organizing, and directing, then your liability coverage would cover your exposure, but any of the third parties that would be participating in the parade, your coverage would not extend to them. So you would want to consider having either a special events policy or having the individual participants, depending on if they're just walking or if they're riding in vehicles, verifying insurance coverage. But we can talk more specifically about your specific event if you want to reach out.
Okay. All right, Amber, anything else?
Nope, that was the only question that we see.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all again for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.